hasn't changed. And let me talk about the World Conference and try to put it in context. Why is this so important? Why did I go? What did I learn? And what are some of the continuing themes and issues? First, a little bit of background. When I was a student in college at Stanford in the early 1970s, I had the honor of serving under a great Pan-Africanist. His name was Dr. Sinclair Drake. He and Horace Caton wrote one of the early important works about the blacks in urban America in the early 1930s. And he was a professor at Stanford in sociology and anthropology. And he asked if I would, as one of his mentees, actually go to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, to deliver, literally to deliver, not to present, but to deliver his paper on the 6th Pan-African Congress. The Pan-African Congresses were meetings held outside of Africa in the 19th and 20th century where African nations were fighting to end colonialism and trying to remove the vestiges of slavery that dominated the centuries before the 20th century. And this was a celebratory conference in the 1970s because this is the first time in the 1970s that most African countries were free from colonialism. There were a few that were still under colonial rule in the 1970s. Zimbabwe was in the process of ridding itself of the offals of a form of apartheid, and South Africa was still invested in apartheid. Before I went to the conference, delivered the paper, but it was an amazing set of issues that occurred there that relate very much to the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa in the year 2001. But I came back from that conference empowered, thinking that, wow, you know, there's a lot going on in Africa, there's a lot going on with race, and we need to capitalize on it. And so because I had done pretty well at Stanford, I was able to write an honors thesis when I returned. And my honors thesis was on the efficacy of sanctions as a tool in ending apartheid in Southern Africa. And in that paper that I published in 1994, I made two predictions. One is that Zimbabwe would in fact be free as a result of sanctions, and that South Africa would in fact be free if we applied sanctions appropriately. My professor, who was an expert in Africa, gave me an A- on the paper. And he said that he thought that it was well-researched, well-written, but that I was a little bit romantic in thinking that South Africa could ever be free as a result of sanctions. And he might have been right for the 1970s, but even though the statute of limitations has passed, I have been thinking of going back to Stanford and asking for an A+ instead of an A-, because I was right, I was just ahead of my time, and ahead of his time. But it gave me a special sense about South Africa and what it represents and why it's so important to all of us as a nation. The figures aren't precisely right, but they can help you get a sense of how to frame the issue. Let me talk about this country. Many of you may remember in the early 1990s there was a significant, perhaps one of the most significant conferences held in the 20th century. It was a world conference. It was focused on gender issues. It was held in Beijing, China. A very important milestone. Now, what was significant about that? As you can imagine, in the early 1990s, the United States' position toward China was not very favorable. We were very concerned then, as we are now, with human rights violations. We were concerned with China having a very different form of government than our democratic and sort of constitutional-based form of government. And we were very concerned about the symbolism of China, of all nations, hosting a conference about women when we thought that women didn't have equal justice under the law in the nation of China, even though China had, as you know, has the largest population of any country in the world. That was our public political position. And yet, as strong as we felt about China, we invested millions of dollars to make sure that that conference was successful. Millions. More than $10 million supporting the World Conference on gender and on women in China. And there were actually two conferences. We supported them with substantial resources. And we tried to explain it at that time that even though we have views about China or even about the topic, we have to participate in the world discussion about women. It's inevitable. It's unimaginable that we wouldn't. And then we sent the First Lady, some says the co-president, now Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, she was there. Ambassador Madeleine Albright was there, and a number of other top officials, members of Congress, leaders of business and industry. It was well attended. Many of you know people who attended that conference. And by many views, it was a successful conference. And the United States played a significant role. When this World Conference came up about racism, from the beginning, it's not just the Bush administration, but the Clinton administration was reluctant to take a lead role in supporting the conference. And in fact, even though this conference has been planned for years, and the money in other conferences would come much sooner than the actual date of the conference, by the end of this conference, we had committed less than $1 million to South Africa for the entire conference. And neither the Clinton administration nor the Bush administration never made a commitment to support the conference by sending a significant delegation. Why is that important? Many of you may remember the debate last year between George W. Bush, and Al Gore. And George Bush made clear his points of view about nation building and about world affairs. He said very clearly that my administration will not be about nation building. We're not going to be involved in affairs outside of the United States that aren't in our strategic or in some other economic interest. We have a very different attitude about the world, and we're not going to try to solve the world's problems. That was very clear in his early debates. And in fact, the people that he selected, my friend Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, and Donald Rumsfeld, in a sense, have enacted that policy in the sense that we have a narrower view of our world position. We have not, to the extent that presidents from Carter forward have gotten involved in the debate in the Middle East. The Bush administration did not take a firm position, did not try to call the parties together, have not played a significant role before the events of September 11th and before the World Conference. We have looked askance at a lot of the other world's problems. We were against the Kyoto principles. We were removed because of our record from the Human Rights Commission. So the 21st century revealed the world's view toward America and America's view toward the world. It was in light of that that I was particularly excited that Colin Powell was appointed to be in the most powerful position in the United States and the most powerful position ever held by an African American in administration, and that was to affect our foreign policy. Now, if you were to ask him today, or yesterday, or a month ago, or 2 months ago, General Colin Powell, whether he really wanted to go to the World Conference or thought he should be there, he would say, absolutely not. I agree with the administration's positions. I'm not going to call Colin Powell a liar. I'm not going to do that. But in many respects, it's inconceivable to me that, one, he wouldn't want to be there, and two, he didn't hope to be there, and three, he wouldn't have played a significant role if he'd chosen to be there. Why is Colin Powell so important on this issue of the World Conference Against Racism? Other than Nelson Mandela, I can think of few people of color who could play such a significant role by their own story in dealing with race and transcending the boundaries of race, who would have been a pivotal figure in that conference. I can think of few people who could have had Yasser Arafat and President Sharon and others sit down at the same table and have discussions about world peace. I can think of few people who had a better relationship with the brown and the black leaders from around the world. And I can think of few people who could take the moral high ground to talk about that we as one world and not as one and separate and isolated nation.